Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a big one: fossil fuels and the future of energy.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
We've got quite the stack of research for this one.
Yeah, we do.
Academic papers, industry reports, even a pretty cool YouTube video.
A lot of information out there.
But they're all basically wrestling with the same question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Can we ditch fossil fuels
Right.
without totally sacrificing progress?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It really touches on just about every aspect of modern life.
Right.
Economics, the environment, everything. I think to really wrap our heads around it, though, we got to start with a little bit of history.
Okay, let's go way back.
Okay.
Fossil fuels. Basically, the unsung heroes of the Industrial Revolution, right? Powered the factories, trains, all that. Basically launched us headfirst into the modern world.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, before fossil fuels, the energy we had was mostly limited to, well, what humans and animals could produce. So the jump to these concentrated sources of energy, it was a game changer. Like massive technological advancements, economic growth. I mean, it's tough to even imagine our world today
Right.
without the energy that comes from fossil fuels.
Yeah, it really is wild to think about how dependent we still are on a discovery from, like, what, centuries ago?
Yeah, for sure.
But we all know there's a downside, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
A pretty big downside.
Like a really big downside.
Burning fossil fuels releases those greenhouse gases, and that makes it, well, pretty much the biggest contributor to climate change, and we're starting to see the consequences.
It's scary stuff. One of our sources, a fact sheet from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, EESI, they say that fossil fuels make up a whopping 74% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions.
74%.
That's huge.
Yeah, and all those emissions, they come with a cost, a real cost that isn't always included in, well, like the price of gas or whatever. Right.
We call these externalities.
Okay, externalities.
It's the hidden cost that everyone pays, society as a whole, not just the person buying the gas.
Gotcha. So we're all footing the bill, even if we don't realize it.
Exactly.
So what are some of those hidden costs?
One of the biggest ones is the impact on our oceans. That ESI fact sheet that you mentioned, it goes into detail about how the oceans are absorbing all that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it's actually changing the chemistry of the ocean. It's making it more acidic.
Okay, ocean acidification. Not gonna lie, I'm not really sure what that means. Like, what does that actually do to the planet?
Well,
Or to me, for that matter.
you're adding lemon juice to a glass of water, but on a massive scale.
Okay.
And that increased acidity,
Mm-hmm.
it makes it hard for a lot of marine life to survive, like
Yeah.
corals and shellfish, anything that needs to build shells.
I see.
It messes with that process.
That's unsettling. The fact sheet said that ocean acidity has gone up, get this, 30%
30%.
in the last 150 years. Yeah, that's a big jump in a short amount of time.
That's a huge jump.
And it's costing us, like coral reefs, they're in decline because of this acidification. And that's going to hurt industries like fishing and tourism, which, it affects everyone, not just folks living by the coast.
That's right.
It's all connected.
Speaking of costs, that ESI fact sheet, it also talks about the insane amount of money that we're shelling out for extreme weather. And those are getting worse and worse because of climate change, right?
Right. Yeah.
Between 2016 and 2020, just those 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. spent, get this, almost $607 billion on disaster recovery.
607 billion.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Wildfires, hurricanes, floods, like they're all getting more common
Yeah.
and way more destructive.
And on top of that, we've got rising sea levels, which is another thing directly tied to climate change, and that's a real threat to the 40% of Americans who live in coastal communities. Protecting those areas is going to take a ton of money.
Yeah.
And resources.
It's crazy to think about. Like, climate change isn't some far-off thing.
Yeah.
It's happening now.
Right.
It's impacting us right now, right here.
Absolutely.
And it's not just the immediate dangers of a hotter planet, right? Fossil fuels, they come with a whole other set of environmental baggage.
Yeah.
The ESI fact sheet, it lists out things like air and water pollution.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
One example is fracking. I'm sure you've heard of that.
Yeah.
It's a way to get oil and gas out of shale rock. But it takes millions of gallons of water per well, which is a huge strain on water resources.
It's hard to fathom, like, how much water we're talking about. The fact sheet says one fracking well uses between 1.5 and 16 million gallons of water.
Yeah, it's a lot of water.
Where does it all go? Like, what happens to it afterward?
That's another issue. The wastewater from fracking, it can be pretty toxic, full of nasty stuff like arsenic and lead,
Oh, wow.
even mercury.
Yikes.
Yeah, so that can contaminate groundwater and drinking water.
So are we basically trading short-term energy gains for long-term environmental and health problems?
Yeah. I mean, it's
That's
definitely
very tough.
a trade-off that we need to think about really carefully. And the environmental issues, they don't stop there. We got to talk about plastic.
Plastic.
Yeah, did you know that like 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels?
Whoa. I actually did not know that. I know plastic pollution's a big problem, but I didn't realize
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
it was that directly connected to fossil fuels.
We're talking 300 million tons of plastic waste every year globally. And according to the ESI fact sheet, 14 million tons of that ends up in the ocean
14 million tons.
every year.
Wow.
Harming marine life, messing up ecosystems, the whole 9 yards.
How we see those pictures of sea turtles stuck in plastic, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah,
So our plastic habit is actually directly hurting the planet.
it is. And even making the plastic contributes to climate change. The U.S. plastic industry by itself releases a crazy 232 million tons of CO2 equivalent each year. And they think by 2030, they'll be putting out even more emissions than coal power plants.
So we dig up fossil fuels, turn them into plastic, pollute the planet, and make climate change worse, all in one go.
Yeah, basically.
That's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. It really highlights how interconnected all these issues are and how urgent it is that we find some alternatives. But the environmental stuff, that's not the only cost. We got to consider what fossil fuels are doing to our health, too.
Right. Well, air pollution, that's a big one, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I know it's linked to breathing problems, heart problems, even cancer.
Exactly.
Scary stuff.
Air pollution from burning fossil fuels, it's a global health crisis. It's contributing to millions of premature deaths every single year.
The numbers are crazy. One of our sources said that fossil fuel pollution is responsible for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide.
1 in 5.
That's insane.
Yeah.
And it's not affecting everyone equally, right?
No, not at all.
Like communities of color, low-income communities, they're hit the hardest.
They often bear the brunt of the impact. Like the ESI fact sheet, they highlight Cancer Alley in Louisiana.
Yeah.
The cancer risk there is 50 times higher than the national average. It's crazy.
50 times. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. It's largely due to all the industrial activity there, like oil refineries and chemical plants.
Wow. So it's not just about protecting the environment, it's about protecting people, too.
Absolutely. It's a social justice issue as much as anything else.
Okay, so we've established that fossil fuels have a dark side. How do we move on from here? Can we really power the world without these harmful sources?
Well, there's a growing global push to switch from fossil fuels to cleaner sources like solar and wind power.
I've been hearing a lot about those, about renewables.
Yeah.
Are they really a viable alternative? Like, can they handle the load?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, they're getting more competitive all the time. Costs are dropping. The tech is improving rapidly. So it's definitely looking promising.
We have an article here from the India Brand Equity Foundation, IBEF. They're talking about India's plan for solar energy. They want 280 gigawatts of solar power by 2030.
280.
That's a lot of solar panels.
It is. And that's just one example. There's a lot of momentum building around renewables.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It gives me hope that we can actually move away from fossil fuels. But what about things like airplanes?
Yeah, good point.
Like, they still rely on fossil fuels big time. And electric planes, that still seems pretty far off.
It does. You're right. Aviation is definitely a challenge. But there's been some really interesting developments in sustainable aviation fuel, SF.
Yeah, we watched a YouTube video from Carbon Engineering
Yeah.
where they were making S from captured CO2,
Yeah.
like turning pollution into fuel. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's some seriously cool tech, big potential there, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Like, we need to figure out how to produce enough of it to meet the needs of the airline industry, which is only getting bigger, and that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, a webinar from Sustainable Aviation Futures. They talked about all the excitement around SAF, but also the challenges like the cost and getting enough of the raw materials to make it.
Right, and we need policies that encourage the use of SF. We need governments to get on board.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. We know fossil fuels aren't sustainable, but making the switch to clean energy, it's messy.
It is. There's no easy answers here.
It's a tough one.
It's going to take a lot of innovation, a lot of investment, and countries working together.
So much to think about. Let's take a minute to really digest everything we've learned so far, and then we can talk about how to actually move forward.
Sounds good to me. We've got a lot to unpack.
All right, so we've laid out all the problems with fossil fuels.
The environmental damage, the health risks, the climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But knowing the problem is only half the battle, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are the biggest roadblocks to actually making the switch to clean energy?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is just the sheer scale of the change. We were talking about changing a global system
Right.
that's like built into everything. Our infrastructure, our economies, how we live our lives every day. It's not a quick fix.
Yeah, it's like trying to swap out the engine of a car while you're driving down the highway.
Exactly.
It's not just about the new engine, right? You got to think about all the other parts, how they all fit together.
And how they're going to work with that new engine. Another big challenge is how intermittent renewable energy sources are, like solar and wind. I mean, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. We need to find ways to store that energy for when we need it.
It's like trying to power your house with a stationary bike. You might generate some energy when you're pedaling, but when you stop, you need a battery to store it for later.
That's a good analogy. And that's what we need to figure out on a bigger scale, right? Like pumped hydro storage, advanced batteries, even hydrogen.
Those storage solutions sound pretty high-tech. Are we making any headway there?
Oh, for sure.
Like,
battery tech especially, it's come a long way. The price is coming down, storage capacity is going up, and there are exciting new things happening in other energy storage areas too.
okay, that's good news.
Yeah, definitely.
But even with the tech, the economics of it all, of switching to renewables, can feel overwhelming, right? Like the investments are huge.
Well, it's true. The upfront costs are significant, but
Yeah.
you have to weigh that against the cost of doing nothing. The effects of climate change, the damage to the environment, the health problems, all that stuff, it comes with a pretty hefty price tag too.
So investing in clean energy, it's not just good for the environment. It's smart financially, too.
Yeah.
Like spending now to prevent bigger problems later.
Right. Plus, investing in renewables actually creates jobs and boosts the economy. So it's a chance to build a more sustainable future and a stronger economy.
All right, so we've talked about how big of a shift this is, about needing ways to store energy reliably, about the money it takes to make it happen.
Right.
What other hurdles are there?
Well, we can't forget about the political side of things.
Yeah.
The fossil fuel industry is powerful,
Right.
and they have a big interest in keeping things the way they are. We need strong policies and regulations to level the playing field and make that shift to clean energy happen faster.
Sounds like a classic David and Goliath situation.
Yeah.
Clean energy versus the giant fossil fuel industry.
Right.
What kind of policies could actually tip the scales towards clean energy?
Well, one big one is putting a price on carbon emissions.
Okay, so that could be like a carbon tax
Yeah.
or a cap and trade system where companies have to pay for how much they pollute. So if you pollute, you
Yeah.
pay.
Exactly.
It seems fair, right?
Wait.
Like it makes those hidden costs, those externalities actually visible.
Exactly.
Keeps you accountable.
And all the money that comes from those carbon pricing schemes, it can be used to invest in clean energy technology
Oh, that's smart.
and help the communities that are most affected by the shift away from fossil fuels.
Okay.
So it's not just about punishing companies.
Right.
It's about making a system that makes clean energy more attractive and making sure everyone benefits.
Got it.
Another policy that could be really effective is a clean electricity standard.
Okay. What's that?
Basically, it requires utility companies to get a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. It sets a target for how much clean energy they have to use.
Like a quota for clean energy. That
Yeah.
seems like it would really force things to change.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool. And these standards, they're usually set up to increase that percentage of clean energy over time, so it creates a clear path for transitioning away from fossil fuels.
So set ambitious goals and then make a plan to reach them.
Yeah.
Speaking of goals, I've heard a lot of talk about reaching net zero emissions by 2050. That seems like a huge undertaking.
It is.
Is it even possible?
It is ambitious, for sure. But a lot of experts think we can do it. It means completely changing how we get our energy, how we travel, how our industries work, even how we live our lives.
So we all need to become deep divers in our own lives, figure out how to shrink our carbon footprints, and help build a more sustainable future.
I think that's a great point.
Like,
Every little bit helps. But it's not just about what we do individually. We also need some big breakthroughs in clean energy technology to really make a dent in the problem.
yeah, and those innovations are what I really find fascinating. What are some of the exciting things happening in the clean energy world right now?
Well, there's a lot going on, but I'm really excited about the field of advanced materials. Scientists are developing new materials that are lighter, stronger, and more efficient, and these are going to revolutionize everything from solar panels to electric car batteries.
That sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie. What kind of materials are we talking about?
One example is perovskite. It's a material used in solar cells, and it's incredibly good at converting sunlight into electricity. Perovskite solar cells could end up being better than traditional silicon solar cells, both in how efficient they are and how much they cost.
So perovskite could really change the game for solar power. What else is out there?
Another area that's making a lot of progress is artificial photosynthesis.
Hold on, artificial photosynthesis.
Yeah, scientists are trying to copy the way plants turn sunlight into energy, but on a much bigger scale.
So like we could create fuel from sunlight, just like plants.
That's the idea. And it's a pretty amazing one, right? Imagine being able to make fuel without needing fossil fuels or releasing all those harmful emissions.
That would be revolutionary. Earlier we talked about carbon capture and how it's used for sustainable aviation fuel. Is that something that could be used more broadly?
Definitely. Carbon capture is super important for getting to net zero, especially for industries that are hard to transition, like heavy industry and power generation. The idea is to capture the carbon dioxide before it gets released into the atmosphere, and then either store it underground or use it to make other useful things.
It's like cleaning up the mess after you've made it, but in a way that prevents more damage.
Exactly. Right now, carbon capture is pretty expensive.
Yeah.
But the technology is getting better and the costs are coming down.
So we've got advanced materials, artificial photosynthesis, and carbon capture. What other clean energy innovations are you keeping an eye on?
One that I find really cool is biomimicry. It's all about getting inspiration from nature.
Biomimicry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically.
Like, what does that even mean?
Looking to nature to find solutions for design problems. So, for example, engineers have designed wind turbine blades that are shaped like humpback whale fins.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, and it makes them quieter and more efficient.
That's so cool. Nature's been perfecting those designs for millions of years. It's like the ultimate engineer.
Totally. We can learn a lot from nature and use those ideas to create technologies that are more efficient, stronger, and more sustainable.
All right, so we have all these amazing new ideas popping up. The question is, are things moving fast enough? Are we actually using these technologies on a big enough scale to make a real difference for the climate?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, I think the answer right now is not yet.
Not yet.
We've got a lot of promising research and development, but we need to start putting these technologies into action much faster if we want to meet our climate goals.
So it's not enough to invent new things. We have to get them out into the world where they can actually make a difference.
Right. But there are a lot of barriers we have to get over.
Yeah.
Regulations, financing, getting people on board with the changes. It's not easy.
So it's those same hurdles we talked about earlier. It seems like we need a multi-pronged approach. It's not just scientists and engineers. We need policymakers, business leaders, the public, everyone.
You got it. This problem is too big for any one group to solve on their own.
We need everyone on board working together.
Exactly. And speaking of working together, the international community has a really important role to play here. We can't solve climate change or switch to clean energy if every country is just doing their own thing.
Yeah, it's a global problem that needs global solutions.
Yeah.
So let's talk about international cooperation and what that looks like in the context of the energy transition.
That's a great topic, and I think it's a perfect place to pick up after a quick break. We'll be right back.
Okay, so we're back and ready to talk about the global picture. International cooperation.
Right, yeah.
It's easy to focus on what's happening in our own country. But climate change, this is a global problem. It needs a global solution, right?
Absolutely. International cooperation is key for a few reasons. First off, climate change doesn't stop at borders.
Right.
Like emissions from one country affect the whole planet. We need a global plan to deal with it.
It's like if you're having a potluck dinner with your neighbors and someone brings a dish that's gone bad, everyone gets sick.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Another reason is that when countries work together, it helps drive innovation and knowledge sharing. They can learn from each other's successes and mistakes.
Like a giant science fair where everyone shows off their best ideas and
Well,
inventions. We all benefit.
and the last big reason is that it helps make sure the response to climate change is fair. Developing countries, they're often hit the hardest, even though they contribute the least to the problem. Richer countries need to help them transition to clean energy and adapt to the changes that are already happening.
It's about making sure everyone is on board and no one gets left behind.
Exactly.
Are there any examples of international cooperation on climate change that you find particularly hopeful?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC.
Okay, the UNFCCC.
It's a treaty that was signed back in 1992, and it brought almost every country in the world together to work towards a common goal: stabilize greenhouse gases and prevent dangerous climate change.
It's amazing that almost every country in the world could agree on something so important. It really shows that this is something everyone is taking seriously.
Yeah, it really does.
So, under the UNFCCC, countries have come up with different agreements, like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement.
Right, to cut emissions and work together.
I've heard a lot about the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, it's a big one.
What makes it so important?
Well, it was adopted in 2015, and the goal is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Pretty much every country in the world signed on
Wow.
and pledged to reduce their emissions.
That's huge. But how does it actually work? Like, how do they make sure countries stick to their promises?
It's based on these things called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. So each country sets its own targets for cutting emissions based on what they can do.
It's kind of like that potluck dinner again, where everyone brings a dish, but this time they all agree to make healthier, more sustainable choices over time.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And those targets, they're reviewed and updated every 5 years, and the idea is to keep raising the bar. The agreement doesn't really have ways to punish countries if they don't meet their goals, but it relies on transparency and accountability.
So like peer pressure instead of penalties.
Yeah, pretty much. The hope is that countries will do their part because it's the right thing to do, both for themselves and for everyone else. The Paris Agreement isn't perfect, but it's a big step forward for international cooperation on climate change.
Okay, so that's the Paris Agreement.
Right.
Are there other examples of countries working together on clean energy?
Oh, tons. The European Union, for instance, they have some really strong climate and energy policies.
Yeah.
They have a carbon trading system. They've set big goals for renewable energy, and they're working with other countries to promote clean tech and help developing nations make the switch.
I've heard a lot about the EU taking the lead on climate action. It's great to see a whole region making such a big effort.
Yeah.
What about the U.S.? Where do we stand on international cooperation?
Well, the U.S. has kind of gone back and forth on this.
Yeah.
The previous administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement,
Right.
but the current administration rejoined, and they're working with other countries to deal with the climate crisis.
That's good to hear. It seems like the U.S. is realizing that they can't solve this problem on their own.
Right.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle by only looking at one corner.
Exactly. You need to see the whole picture and work with others to put it all together. The U.S. has a lot to offer in terms of technology and resources. By working with other countries, we can make a big difference in the fight against climate change.
It's inspiring to see the global community coming together to tackle this challenge. But what about us as individuals? What can we do to help make the transition to clean energy happen?
I know it can feel overwhelming, like our individual actions don't really matter, but they do. There are things we can all do in our daily lives to use less fossil fuels and support the shift to clean energy.
So what are some practical things we can do?
Well, we can try to drive less, take public transit, walk, bike, or carpool whenever possible, choose fuel-efficient vehicles, and think about getting an electric car.
Those are great tips. What about our homes? Can we make them more energy efficient?
Absolutely. You can improve insulation, seal up any drafts, and switch to appliances that use less energy. And if you can, installing solar panels is a great option. Even little things like turning off lights when you leave a room or unplugging chargers can make a difference.
It's all about being aware of how much energy we're using and making choices to reduce our impact.
Exactly.
What about our diets? I've heard that what we eat can have a big impact on the environment.
That's true. Raising livestock, especially for beef, produces a lot of greenhouse gases. Eating less meat, even just having a few meatless meals each week, can really help.
Maybe meatless Mondays aren't such a bad idea. And what about traveling? Is there a way to explore the world without harming the planet?
Well, whenever possible, try to choose more sustainable options like trains or buses. And when you do fly, try to support airlines that are making an effort to be more sustainable. You can also look into carbon offsetting programs.
Carbon offsetting, that's something I've been wanting to learn more about. What exactly is it?
Basically, it means investing in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions to compensate for the emissions you can't avoid. So things like planting trees or supporting renewable energy projects.
It's kind of like balancing the scales,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We can't completely erase our impact, but we can do things to make up for it.
Right. And beyond what we do as individuals, we can use our voices and our votes to push for policies that promote clean energy and address climate change. Supporting politicians who care about these issues, having conversations in our communities, all of that can make a difference.
It's about building a culture of sustainability and demanding action from our leaders.
Totally. And remember, we don't have to be perfect, but we can all try to make a difference. Every step we take, no matter how small, it helps.
That's a great message. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the history of fossil fuels to all the exciting new developments in clean energy. The bottom line is this: switching to a sustainable future is a team effort. We need governments, businesses, and individuals all working together.
I agree completely. It's a challenge, but it's also a chance to build a better, cleaner, and more sustainable world for ourselves and future generations.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to keep exploring these issues. Remember, every little bit helps. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep asking questions.